Welcome back to the HM Intelligence channel. Today we're going to do something a bit different. Instead of covering off a conflict, even though there is a pretty significant one that just took place, we're going to cover off my predictions for 2026. We're going to look at 5 kind of key geopolitical contests that I think will be pretty critical this year. And I'll lay out my assessments. I'll give you a most likely, a most dangerous, and a wild card for each, and then we'll look at some indicators and warnings for each conflict. But firstly, why are we doing this? So I saw another YouTuber do something similar when it came to like economics. Found it pretty interesting, and he also talked about this interesting concept of chicken sexting. It's where people can essentially tell if baby chickens are male or female purely from vibes, for want of a better word. It's a bit random, but he explained it's like a good way of, you lay out your thoughts for the year in a video, and then at the end of the year, you come back and have a look and see how well you did. And from that, you can kind of recalibrate and better understand, how your thinking works, what your biases are, etc. Also, it's a bit of fun. This will be an interesting video and something we can look back on in 12 months and kind of see how good my assessments were, which should be pretty interesting. So firstly, looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think peace remains unlikely this year. The most likely course of action in my mind is that the conflict will become protracted, will become more of a war of attrition, more than it already is, with Russia slowly grinding forward over the months with no real change. This is essentially what we've seen over the last year, I see this as probably the most likely course of action, and just continuation of what we've already seen. The most dangerous would be the complete abandonment from the US, leading to Ukraine's collapse. This would be a pretty bad situation in my mind, and something I don't really want to see. And a wild card's course of action would be the Russian economic situation becomes untenable, leading to the collapse of the country and probably regime change. It's possible, but it's a bit of a wild card. And what we can kind of look at for this is mobilization numbers both in Russia and Ukraine. These are pretty key for how the war's going. There's already been indications that maybe Russia can't sustain the numbers that they have been over the past few years, and this could become pretty key in the conflict. Also, US political rhetoric. What's Trump saying? What's Trump doing? What's the US and European stance? The progress of ceasefire negotiations. In my mind, this is just a way of Russia protracting the conflict without actually really doing anything, but, what changes on that front? Also, domestic pressure in Russia. How's this changing? Are Russians supportive of the war? Are they against the war? That could be pretty key. And then also, like, any reporting of oligarchs reaching out to the West. This would be pretty key to how the war's going. A pretty key indicator in my mind. Then we have Venezuela. As of yesterday of recording, this has become a much more interesting situation. Yesterday Maduro was captured, I guess we would call it, by the US and taken back to the USA, where he's facing charges on a range of things. But yeah, I think political transition is likely, but it's not going to be an easy situation, with the most likely course of action being a transitional government is installed, leading to elections pretty soon, and hopefully long-term stability in the country. The most dangerous course of action here would be an increase in violence that leads to the fracturing of the state, possibly running out into even like a civil war style situation. This would be a pretty bad situation, and probably the most negative outcome in my mind. There's also the wild card option that, Trump tries to take over the country with some kind of like US leadership. I think this is pretty unlikely, but it is not out of the realms of possibility, especially when we talk about Trump. This would lead to some significant international condemnation. So far, the pushback within the Western community hasn't been that harsh. Obviously, it's been pretty harsh from like Russia, China, and BRICS nations, but so far the West hasn't really said too much negative about the whole Venezuela thing. And then some quick key indicators for this would be any riots, civil unrest within Venezuela, how that kind of goes. When there is an election, the voter turnout. Often oppositions try and boycott elections to make them discredit them or make them untenable. This would be a pretty key indicator for how the long-term stability is going to go. What Trump's saying and any US political rhetoric around control of the country, and also the international response for the whole situation and how it's kind of played out. These will all be pretty key indicators in my mind for what the long-term outcome will be here. Then we have Taiwan and China. It has the possibility of being a very, very tricky situation, let's say. But I still think it's unlikely that China invades Taiwan in 2026. The most likely course of action I see is an increase in political and economic pressure from China on Taiwan, using their economic might to try and build support against Taiwan within the international community. This is kind of what you see in the Pacific, where they use aid, infrastructure, and other things to try and convince smaller nations to turn their back on Taiwan in the international stage. The most dangerous course of action here, I think, would be an air and sea blockade. This could be pretty dramatic, and this would be kind of the prelude to a war, I see. I don't think it's likely in the next 12 months, but it is a pretty dangerous situation if it does come into effect. China has shown that they have the capability and possibly the intent to do this type of operation through their military exercises, and we'll talk about indicators shortly. And then a wild card could be an increase in grey zone operations to stir up civil unrest within Taiwan. This could also be a pretext for Chinese military aggression, saying that, the Taiwanese leadership can't control their country, can't keep the people of Taiwan safe, and therefore China needs to intervene to keep what they would see as ethnically Chinese people safe from a tyrannical government. Unlikely, but that's what wildcards are for. And some key indicators and warnings here would be, what's China saying? What's their political rhetoric? How are they talking about it? Is there large-scale military build-ups? This often happens with exercises, but as we saw in Russia, these are ways of building situations that seem normal to the international community, and then one day you just turn an exercise into an invasion. There are key indicators around that, around like movement of blood. That was a big one within Ukraine. People saw blood being brought up to the front lines for the first time. There's only one real reason you would need large stockpiles of blood near a border, and that would be a military conflict. Also, the stockpiling of resources that China doesn't really have. There has already been reports that China's started to do this, but expanding on the stockpiling would be a key indicator that they are preparing for a conflict. This is due to them preparing to kind of be excluded from the international community. So they're trying to build up all the resources they may need for the conflict and for the inevitable fallout of whatever happens due to the conflict. And then international dialogue on Taiwan. How are they affecting countries supporting Taiwan? How are they talking about Taiwan? Just stuff like that. Always good to watch when it comes to the Taiwanese conflict. Next, we have Myanmar. I think it's highly likely that we'll basically see the status quo of hostilities throughout the country over the next 12 months. Most likely, laid out there, conflict continues to rage through 2026. So basically no change on what we're currently seeing. I think estimates currently put rebel control of the country at around 40%, with the government at around 30%. A most dangerous course of action here would be China kind of expands the conflict through large-scale support of the Myanmar government. They are already their biggest backers, but they don't really have like, what would you call it, like military liaison in there, helping advise and assist in the conflict. This type of support could see the expansion and kind of ramping up of the military conflict. It's possible that this will happen towards kind of the end of the current leadership's life, when things, if it looks like the rebels may be starting to win and topple the regime, then it's possible that China will come in and try and support them to try and basically turn the tide. And then a bit of a wild card would be the rebels receive enhanced support from the West. So far, Western support to rebels fighting in this conflict has been pretty minimal. If there was a large-scale uptick in support, we could see a pretty resounding victory here for the rebel forces, which the West doesn't really talk about and doesn't really seem that interested in doing. So whether it will happen seems unlikely, but it's a possibility. There's some key indicators here, as I kind of just laid out in both the most dangerous and wildcard, is the levels of external support for both sides. What it looks like, the amounts of equipment and weaponry that we are giving to both the rebels and that China is giving to the government is going to be a key indicator of how it's going to go. Whether there becomes any attempts at dialogue will also be interesting. So far, doesn't really seem to be much negotiation. There was a ceasefire when they had an earthquake recently, but outside of that, neither side seems willing to talk this out. They seem pretty keen to fight to the end. Kind of an interesting indicator would be the unity or division of rebels. So far, they seem to work together pretty well, but these are a lot of different ethnic kind of tribes and groups that fight together against the government. If these groups were to become divided, then it could cause a bit of a fracture within the rebels and create issues when fighting against the government. And then also shifts in the conflict. So far, it's been basically isolated to jungle warfare with very minimal fighting within cities, but this could shift, especially towards the end of the conflict. But we'll have to see. And then we have Thailand and Cambodia. I think continued peace here is a possibility, though it requires a lot of external support. So the most likely course of action would be the tense ceasefire holds through international support from the Asian community and also US and China, with the most dangerous being the resumption of conflict due to a lack of trust between Thailand and Cambodia. This is kind of the underlying issue between both sides. Neither side trusts each other, and therefore any attempts for peace kind of fall apart. And a bit of a wild card would be international interference expands the conflict and kind of ramps it up. I think the most likely people to do this would be China, but it's possible that the US could get involved, and that would also trouble China, who doesn't want to see any expanded US support for Thailand, kind of in their backyard. Key indicators here, ceasefire violations. These pretty quickly lead to a breakdown in the ceasefire, as we saw a month ago, with a couple of people getting injured by landmines, very quickly turned into a renewed of hostilities. Troop build-ups and redeployments, this kind of indicates that it's all about to break down. Also the rhetoric, both internationally and domestically from their leaders. This has been like a kind of a key issue within both countries, where neither side wants to be seen as backing down. So they essentially have to go to war to not lose face in their domestic political market. But yeah, and then on the positive side, any progression of peace talks, any introduction of international observers to ensure the peace, this would be a big win. As I said before, trust has been a very big issue for these two countries. So a third party monitoring the situation would be probably one of the best outcomes and the best ways to achieve long-term peace. And then quickly, just some other conflicts. The Sudan conflict, much like most, I think this is just set to rage on for 2026. I can't really see either side trying to go for peace or backing down. It's a horrific situation, and I sadly don't think much is going to change. Yemen, I think much like Sudan, it's just going to keep ramping up. The UAE seems to be toning down, if not withdrawing support from the units that they were supporting, with Saudi taking over some military bases in the last couple of days. But, the Houthis are still there. But, whatever happens in Iran will directly affect the Houthi rebels. If the Iranian regime was to collapse, then it's quite possible that the Houthis would collapse also, as they wouldn't be getting any support from the IRGC. So then Iran. I think it's unlikely that the regime is going to fall in the next 12 months, but there is a possibility. The protests that have happened over the last few days have definitely ramped up. And while we haven't seen any external players kind of talking about this yet, it's definitely possible. But no, definitely one to watch, and one it could happen all at once, is kind of how I see it. It could be like nothing, and then very quickly the Iranian regime has collapsed and we don't really know what to do. And then Ethiopia. The kind of thing I wanted to point out here is that it's possible that Ethiopia will go to war with Eritrea. The primary goal here would be to gain access to the sea, which has been a significant issue for Ethiopia in the last 30, 40 years, however long it is since they basically ended the conflict with Eritrea. There's definitely been a ramping up of political rhetoric from the Ethiopian government around this, so it's definitely one to watch, and one that could kick off very quickly. So yeah, that's been my breakdown of conflicts for 2026. Definitely a longer video than I had planned. But please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I got things right or wrong? Let me know. I'm very interested in what you think is going to happen over the next 12 months, as I think it may be an extremely turbulent year when it comes to geopolitics. But anyway, I've been your host, Daniel. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you next week. See you.